Hello, countercultural comrades. I'm Stephen Coates, and this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I want to start this episode of the Bureau off with special thanks. Thanks to Ronnie Lambert, my regular correspondent. He sent me many good things, but in particular, he turned me on to the subjects of this episode. Thanks, Ronnie. And Nancy Thompson, who reminded me of it too. And thanks also to other recent correspondents. Kenneth, who's pointed me at a wonderful Australian countercultural story I'm looking forward to investigating. It's good to travel the world, isn't it? And to Peter, Richard and James for their thoughts, Daniel, Jonty and Daria for their appreciation, and to Jim, who's invited me to visit him at the British Museum where he works. I'll be accepting that invitation, Jim. Thank you. Join them at bureauoflostculture.com, where you can get all our stories and our bulletin of Lost Culture. You can send us a message, leave us a review. I might just read it out on the show if you do. And thanks to Youth, Chris Tofu, Kate and John, who was with last night plotting countercultural things to come. But back to today. This episode is called Julie and Christine. Christine Bott was a practising doctor living in a rural countercultural place in mid-Wales. Organic farming, making crafts, rearing goats. She was also a pivotal figure in the illicit production and distribution of LSD in the UK during the 1970s, an activity that ultimately led to her arrest and imprisonment amongst the 36 most dangerous women in the country, including the child murderer Myra Hindley. Sergeant Julie Taylor was a police officer who gave her name to Operation Julie, one of the biggest police operations in the UK in the 70s, and one which busted a massive LSD manufacturing and distribution network. The operation, which took place in Wales and England, resulted in the arrest and conviction of over 100 individuals, including some of the most prolific LSD chemists of the era, and Christine Bott. Now, there's an awful lot been written about Operation Julie in recent years. Books, articles, there's been radio shows, there's even a musical. But Christine's story, like those of many women in the counterculture, has been rather forgotten. Her recollections of her life in mid-Wales and the operation which led to her arrest are extraordinary. But also, as extraordinary, I think, are her recollections of her time in prison. And we can read them all thanks to my guest today, Catherine Kate Hayes, a psychotherapist who met Christine, who was also training to be a psychotherapist in later life. And Kate has lately become an author because she made a promise to her friend, Christine Bott, that she would tell the story to the world. And that's a promise that she's devoted a substantial amount of her time and resources to keep. And it's now resulted in 2 books. The Untold Story of Christine Bott and a book about the LSD chemist Richard Kemp, Christine's partner, based on the only interviews that he has given since his release from prison. These are extraordinary countercultural stories. We're about to dig into them and hear more because Kate is here with me now. Hello, Kate.
It's lovely to be here. Very excited to be here.
And of course, I've heard about you a bit from various people. Ronnie, one of my regular correspondents.
Such a lovely man.
Yeah, well, he's been telling me about you for quite a while. And then my recent interviewee, Nancy Thompson.
Yeah.
So it's great to hear from you. You got in contact after that interview.
Yeah.
And lots of countercultural threads here. And you sent me this book. And I have to say, I think I said this to you the other day, I've absolutely loved reading this book, even though it's very dark. Sorry, I was reading it in the bath the other night. Stayed to the end, so the bathwater was cold.
What a great review.
Put that on the back, yeah. I let my bath go cold whilst reading this book. It's your promise, this book. It's a promise that you made to your friend, Christine Bott. And I wanted to start with that promise, at the end, as it were.
Yeah.
Tell us about how that promise was made, why it was made.
So Chris had disappeared off to America, fell in love, and she followed her bloke. And then we kept in touch, and she kept on inviting me over with my son, and we never made it. But then one day I got the phone call of, Kate, I'm dying. I've got to come back, sort my family out. Then she also sent me the file of what she'd written so far. And just by complete coincidence, as these things often are, I met an old friend of mine who had been involved in making TV programs and films, who I grew up with. And I just happened to mention, oh, you'll never believe it, but, I've met this woman. And he said, oh, my God, I've been wanting to tell that story all my life, because he knew all about the original story called Operation Julie and that big drug bust. So I contacted Chris and said, look, my friend thinks this would be a brilliant film. And she said, let's do it. This would have been around the May of 2007. Chris thought she had longer to live. We didn't know it was going to be absolutely fatal, the cancer. So we started to do recordings. I started to go and talk to her in her place, and she used to come to me when she was going for acupuncture to help with the pain and with the meds and everything. So she'd come to my house and sit and look at my garden, which she loved. So we had the script that she'd written, and then there was the additional stuff she wanted to tell me. And then she just really deteriorated. It was like, I want to tell my story. And she trusted me to be the person to help with that. So that's how it happened. But then her dying process sort of took over, and over the next sort of 3 or 4 months. And I was with her as she died and managed to help her reconcile. She'd left her husband at the time, and they hadn't spoken since she'd been back in England. But I managed to facilitate a phone call between her and him. She died a month after my mother. So I was in a kind of, traumatized, bereaved state, and then had to take care of my father. There was a big hiccup in between her death and then me publishing the book in 2021. It's a long time.
But you stayed true to your promise to her. And,
I did, and then I just thought, just stick with her words. Don't fuss around trying to make something clever out of it. She's a good writer. Just let her speak for herself, even though at that point, the story was incomplete because it ended at the point of her being arrested. And I thought that was all there was, because the videos that I'd made with her family refused to return them to me. I gave them to Chris to look at. She wanted to see what she'd said. She then died, and then, unfortunately, one of her relatives who had hold of them wouldn't return them to me.
Do you know where that was?
I think the stigma.
Some shame still around.
Yeah. And fear, because they've been hounded by the press. Because there's this myth about there still being either money or LSD.
Acid somewhere.
Hiding.
Buried somewhere, like some sort of Tibetan turtle or something.
The holy grail of LSD is somewhere. Maybe Wales. Maybe Suffolk. Who knows?
Who knows, right. Yeah, well, one day, and some metal detector's going to come across something very interesting, possibly. The book that I'm holding here, of course, is the sort of second edition, isn't it? With the additional material, you've also published another book about Richard Kemp, who was obviously Christine's partner during those times. It's probably better known than her. And, of course, one of the things which is interesting, Christine was been in the shadow somewhat, hasn't she, in the Operation Julie story. There's obviously interest about her because she was a doctor, etc. But she's been sort of in the background, a little bit like Rose Simpson in the Incredible String Band story. The muse, somebody's taking care of the house and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And yet she got sentenced to 9 years in prison. And one of the things which has been most interesting for me in the book, actually, is her description of her time in prison, which is dark, not unremittingly dark, but it's pretty dark.
Yeah.
And I thought what we could do is talk about her life in sections. There's this upper middle class girl growing up. There's meeting Richard Kemp at Liverpool University, and then everything that happens around LSD and Operation Julie. And then there's the 5.5 years in prison. And then there's her time post that, including her friendship with you and everything that happened since.
Yeah.
So if we cycle back, tell us a little bit about her as this upper middle class girl.
Yes. So Dad was in the army, and So Mum was essentially a single parent and had her mother living adjacent to her in what looked quite a ramshackly old cottage with an outside loo, because she talks about having to empty the loo and everything. So it doesn't sound like posh middle class, but it's like... But then a grandparent was a cartoonist. So there's this sort of arty thing going on. And then the other grandmother was apparently quite strict. So there were these contrasts and high expectations. And then suddenly Dad comes back and takes her and his wife to Benghazi. But there was also tension. Unfortunately, I think was a heavy drinker that impacted on his moods. But one thing she does say is that if she shut her door of her room, she was left alone. So she'd escape into her room.
Which, of course, prefigures how she deals with prison later, doesn't it? She talks about the cell, but she talks about it as a kind of refuge almost, right?
That's right. So then catapulted back to Suffolk to go to secondary school, and then wins an award and wins a place at Liverpool University to study medicine. And then that's where everything else happens.
That's where it all goes wrong. It's all right, depending on which way you look at it. This is in the 60s, of course, isn't it?
Yes. So her first years there, she was unfortunately in a violent relationship, and she described it as a passionate relationship. So I guess it was one where a lot of women might associate, there's the violence and then there's the making up kind of thing. Pretty grim. It's very interesting to have got this writing later, because it wasn't the Chris that I met and knew, who was independent, fierce-minded, she had a powerful presence. There was something about her she was quite the outlaw, and she quite liked that.
It's anti-establishment spirit in terms of her choices. So she's at Liverpool University and she meets this Richard Kemp, as a PhD chemistry student, and from a kind of working class background, but very, very clever. It sort of got there by virtue of
winning
scholarships
awards.
And bursaries and things like that.
Yeah.
And they sort of get together, I think he describes it in your interview with him, as sort of by accident almost. I think she fancied his friend, and she
why don't you go out with me?
Settles for him. Yeah. A momentous decision.
Yeah.
And she's a medical student as well.
Yes.
Not that usual at the time. And he's a super brainy chemistry student.
Yes. So I think the link there is the guy he sat next to in his laboratory was a guy called Nick Green. And he came from quite upper middle class background. Father was a concert pianist and mother ran a supper club. He used cannabis and his parents knew that he used cannabis. And they were quite unbothered by that because it helped him with his epilepsy.
So at the time, cannabis was very easy to get on prescription in terms of tincture, wasn't it, from doctors?
There was a place in London that you could get the tincture from. Yeah. Nick met David Solomon, who is like the jazz freak head who brought all of Leary's ideas over to Cambridge, which is where he was based.
And David Solomon was quite a character, wasn't he? I mean, beat writer.
Yeah. What's it called? LSD, the mind-expanding drug or something.
And a kind of proselytizer for the drug and mind expansion that drugs could bring.
He was, as you might expect someone in that era to be, in terms of everyone's got to do it. And he didn't care about who knew, whereas Christine was quite closed down and Richard, they were quite careful. David would go through borders smoking joints by way of trying to sort of...
Bold but foolish, let's put it that way.
David asked Nick if he could make synthetic cannabis. And Nick knew he didn't have the talent that Richard had, so he called Richard up and said, would you be interested? This is before Richard meets Christine. Right. Then enters Paul Anaboldi, who was Mr. Bounty, Bounty bars.
The chocolate bar?
In the advert, he played the sort of oil glistening Adonis on the beach. The hula girls would go and feed him the bounty.
They got the bounty, or he got the bounty, or whatever it was.
He had an accident, so he had a whole heap of money that he was living off. He lived in an island. He came and saw David and said, "What are you doing messing around with cannabis? You should be making LSD." Interestingly, when I talked to Richard about, the LSD and where he first took it, and he said, "The only LSD I ever took was my own." Like, as if he was kind of affronted that I would imagine that he would trust anyone else's. So he made his own LSD, and very quickly it became clear that he was very talented at it.
Here is a sidebar about LSD chemists. In the 1960s and 70s and 80s, these individuals seem to have been driven by a combination of scientific curiosity, countercultural ideals, anti-establishment spirit, and perhaps some greed. Here are some of the most notable. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love was a famous underground group active in the late 60s and early 70s that produced and distributed millions of doses of LSD and other psychedelic substances. The Brotherhood, founded by John Griggs and various others in 1966, had a mission to raise the spiritual consciousness of the population. They obtained their initial LSD supply from the legendary chemist Owsley Stanley. Owsley Stanley, better known as the Bear, was one of the most legendary and influential chemists of the 60s countercultural movement. From his underground lab, Stanley supplied immense quantities of extremely pure LSD, nicknamed Owsley Acid, to the Grateful Dead, Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters, and a vast swathe of the psychedelic community. His expert chemistry skills and meticulous manufacturing process produced LSD of legendary potency and purity that defined the classic psychedelic experience for a generation. In 1967, he was arrested in one of the biggest LSD busts of the era and sentenced to a time in prison. Upon his release, he largely avoided the limelight, choosing to pursue his passions for audio engineering and clandestine chemistry until his death in 2011. Nicholas Sand was a cult figure known in the psychedelic community for his work as a chemist for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and has been credited as the first underground chemist on record to have synthesized DMT. In 1967, he was introduced to fellow chemist Tim Scully, who trained under Stanley. After being arrested in 1974, Sand and Scully were found guilty due to the testimony of various informants. Sand was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, and after going on the run, lots more adventures and arrests, he was eventually paroled in 2001 and died of a heart attack in his sleep in 2017. Leonard Pickard was a respected chemist, researcher and author. He's one of two people convicted in the largest LSD bust in American history. Twice arrested and sentenced 20 years. In prison he wrote The Rose of Paracelsus, generally regarded as a masterpiece of psychedelic literature. He was released in 2020 on compassionate grounds and continues to write and research on the subject of drugs and acts as a consultant for the JLS Hedge Fund, major investors in psychedelic research. Richard Kemp, as we will hear, gained notoriety for his LSD synthesis efforts in the 60s and early 70s. He's the inventor of the microdot, generally regarded as the best LSD in Christendom. He now lives as a recluse in Spain, refusing all interviews, except in the case of the ones he granted to my guest Kate. Paul Joseph Arnaboldi, an ex-New Jersey school teacher, another friend of Timothy Leary and the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, bought the house in mid-Wales that Christine and Richard Kemp lived in, on the pretense that he was there to complete a biography of President Kennedy. He was at the top of the pyramid of the conspiracy to manufacture and market the microdots. But at the time of Operation Julie, he's believed to have been tipped off, fled to Mallorca. He then flew to America and disappeared, but is believed to have died at Daya. Amanda Feeling, one of the few women in this group, is a noted advocate for the scientific study of psychedelics and their potential therapeutic applications. In the 60s, she was involved in the production and distribution of LSD, working closely with chemists and researchers to explore the boundaries of human consciousness. She was also married to Joey Mellon, one of my previous guests, and along with Joey, self-trepanned by drilling a hole in her head in the late 60s. Amanda's commitment to the field has continued through her work with the Beckley Foundation, a non-profit group dedicated to pioneering research into the effects of psychoactive substances.
Paul's role in this was to persuade David Solomon, don't
mess around with THC and cannabis. There's something much more powerful and much more lucrative and easy to smuggle, let's face it. LSD, we can change the world with it. David then persuades Richard to manufacture it. And just as a sort of footnote, where did they get the script?
Interesting you should say easy to smuggle, because when they're using the actual base chemical, ergotamine, it's a liquid in bottles, so not that easy to smuggle. And Richard thinks it got FedExed over. The first lot of ergotamine arrived, and he then used his laboratory at the university in the evening to start experimenting with making it, and was successful.
Presumably the basic technique and the other chemicals needed and the processing was known anyway then. So once you've got your hands on the main ingredient, ergotamine, and you can find the other constituents,
yes,
and you know what you're doing.
So I felt like I have a PhD now in chemistry, because
Richard Kemp bored you to death with it.
That's all he wanted to talk about.
Because I had a great conversation with Leonard Pickard, and of course, it's still chemists, these people. They love talking about the chemistry. You know, you're trying to get them onto the psychedelic stuff and the relationships.
Which is what I wanted to know. Were you in love, Richard?
Well, let's talk about the molecules. So his talent, the raw ingredients, and the method come together in the evening, Liverpool University, and he starts his journey to change the world.
Yes, and you know, in the meantime, in California, everybody was getting locked up, so they needed a new source for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Then enters stage left Ron Stark, who is the guy that knew all of the bankers in Europe and knew that this particular laboratory in Paris was needing some help, and his chemist at the time was going a little bit out of control. So they headhunt Richard, ask him to relinquish his PhD and go and work and live in Paris, which is what he then does.
When you say bankers, you mean the financiers behind the
actually the bankers.
Actual bankers?
Yeah, one of the things I said to Richard was, so, you know, all of this was illegal. And he said, well, as long as we paid them, they didn't care. So there was a kind of implicit sort of, what's the word, collusion, if you like, between the bankers, the suppliers of the chemical, and I guess to some degree, the ones that really were going to be hammered were the distributors.
I mean, it's not been that different recently in America with street opiates. Their import has been either forbidden or kind of controlled, but the basic chemicals which have been coming from China, it's just the same thing. I mean, the people who produce the chemicals, as soon as if you pay them, they'll sell them. Yeah. That's it, right?
Yeah.
So he goes to Paris, which must have been quite exotic for a sort of northern lad.
Yeah,
right?
Was bought this rather extraordinary car, a Bernadetta Ferrari or something. He was kind of in tithe chemist. He didn't actually get paid money. He just got given things, a place to live, good food. And as he was sort of working it out, and I think by then with Christine's sort of insight as well, they were thinking, hang on a minute, we're just being ripped off here. We're risking our freedom. And someone somewhere is making a lot of money, and we don't actually own our own property anywhere or have any means to do anything independently. So Richard then leaves, and he wants to kind of have control himself, and goes back to David, who is quite happy to see him back. Initially, it's a bit like Breaking Bad, going off to different places around Liverpool and other parts of the country where they were finding disused flats, finding the lab equipment, which you could pick up at a second-hand shop at the time, creating their laboratories, doing a run, dismantling the laboratory, taking the product, burying it somewhere until they were ready to distribute it. And then Paul wanted to buy a place somewhere. So they were starting to look, and it ended up that it was Wales.
Yeah, so somewhere remote, a permanent base.
Yeah.
You're not kind of faffing around with kind of abandoned flats. And there's
Yeah.
a bit in the book when they talk about the fact that they're in a flat in Liverpool and the landlord says it's going to
That's
turn
right.
up and they've got 24 hours to dismantle the lab
Exactly.
and rebuild it again. But I don't want to sort of forget about Christine in this, because that's sort of both their stories, but she'd met Richard and then he's doing this stuff.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about what was going on for her in terms of not only, agreement with what was going on, but a sort of avid supporter of it, because she'd had her own psychedelic experiences, right?
That's right. Coming from her background, for a generational thing, it's quite hard to understand the big rifts that there were between a child and a parent. It was like living on two different planets then in the 60s and 70s. Even though there was lots of people who loved the Beatles and they loved all that music, which kind of united a lot of children and parents, the actual ideology and the ideas of we want peace, we want to stop the war in Vietnam, we want to wake the world up to the environmental crisis. I think part of it was because they were both academics. They had heard about this report that was published by a group called the Club of Rome. And in it, they were predicting the environmental crisis that we're living through now. And Richard and Christine believed that if people could turn on to LSD, or at least turn on to the interconnectivity between everything, which is something that, a lot of people aim to try and achieve through meditation or various other methods of sort of becoming more present to who they are in the world, rather than just being distracted by stuff and things. There really was a sense of urgency at the time. So you had, people like Ginsberg, who I know you've sort of discussed at length on this program, who were kind of inspired by William Blake. So it's got a very long reach, which is the counterculture. It's not like that suddenly, these crazy hippies were just wanting to cause anarchy.
No, they were the sort of latest at the time flowering of a kind of deep countercultural theme that underpins, human history in a way, but it was particularly in these islands, and it's continued since. It's not like it's gone. What you mentioned then I think is really crucial in Christian's story, his too, because even with your interview with him, a couple of years ago, you say he's run out of hope, but the inspiration for this entire crazy endeavour, the caper, as she calls it, was this sense of an ecological crisis and this belief, however naive, that one of the best ways to wake people up was by turning them on. And they'd both been turned on, and in Christine's case, as in your case, because you, in fact, got turned on by one of his microdots, so maybe we could talk about that later. But for many people at the time, well, not for all, of course, don't do this at home, kids, literally mind-blowing cosmic experience of Gaia, you could call it, world and other people, the breaking down of barriers between people, all you need is love, etc. A very profound experience. And that, for both of them, was right in there. And that's what makes this story different than Breaking Bad. Walter White in Breaking Bad, he's got his own motivations, but he doesn't actually take the drug, and it's a different drug anyway. For them, it wasn't really about the money. There wasn't enough money in it. Same for Leonard Pickard. There wasn't actually that much money for the chemists. Maybe the dealers, the distributors were making vast fortunes, but the chemists, top of the pyramid, if you like, they weren't making that much money. They were motivated largely by a vision of making things better for the world, right?
Which they then lived, with the cottage. They had their small holding, reared goats, sheep, chickens, dug their own well. So it's not like they were sort of holding themselves up in some super trendy pad in the middle of London or Paris or anywhere like that. They were living off the land and doing the hard graft, doing the digging and the dreaming, if you like. And if they hadn't been busted, they would still be there. And they might have had their own children. I don't think there was anything more that they wanted from life. And having met Richard, that's what he's still doing. He does his garden. That's what he wants to do. Grow things organically.
So they moved to rural mid Wales, which is a magical place as well, isn't it? And while setting up the labs and in fact, in his case, developing a radical new form of LSD, completely pure, which becomes microdots, right? You know, many people say the best LSD ever made.
Yeah.
They're living the life. They're living the full-on countercultural rural life.
Yeah.
Goats don't get the goat thing at all, but they're eating well, taking care of each other. You know, they're really doing it, aren't they?
They are doing it. Chris is also very interested in medicine. She's very interested in helping people. She had one of her stints was in a psychiatric hospital, and she was absolutely horrified by some of the ways people were being treated. And she was also interested in Lang. She was interested in homeopathy. She was interested in Steiner. She was also interested in all the subtle energies, different ways of healing. It wasn't your conventional GP. And one of the biggest upsets she had, other than prison, was losing her status as a GP. Her colleague, Mark, who also became a distributor, who had moved to Wales, was a doctor as well. He got reinstated after his prison term. He served 3 years. He was actively involved in the distribution. Chris wasn't actively involved in that. Yet they hammered her because she was an unrepentant woman. And the judge didn't like an unrepentant woman.
So she acts as locum. She's a locum in the local GP service. She carries on doing that while they're manufacturing microdots and living the organic life.
Yeah.
Very successfully. Richard's perfected this thing. He wants to make the best acid. He make millions and millions of tabs. It goes out into the world. Changes a lot of people's heads. Fueled the music festivals of the 70s, I believe. Right. Then they have this awful car crash, right, where Richard's driving. The wife of the local minister is killed, you know, and the minister's badly wounded, and it affects them in many ways, I think. Even in your interview with him, he said he's still living it, isn't he? He's still in his conscience. Something's discovered in the car. Police are watching already, but they find the script for the manufacturing LSD in the car, and without realising it, they come under scrutiny. The whole thing rolls on, and this is what becomes Operation Julie, which some listeners will know about.
A team at play from the Julie Squad, a group of young police officers who together smashed the biggest, the richest drug ring ever established in Britain. To do it, they gave a year of their lives. Families, homes, friends and relations were sacrificed as they matched their wits against a team of highly skilled scientists, doctors, academics and businessmen who for 7 long years made millions of pounds out of the sale and manufacture of the mind-expanding drug LSD.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
In those few simple words from Dr. Timothy Leary lay the origins of the problem the Julie Squad had to deal with. At Millbrook in upstate New York in the early 60s, Dr. Leary developed an ideology that spread out to reach millions of young people all over the world. His Brotherhood of Eternal Love argued that the use of LSD broadened the mind, that if enough people took LSD, society would change for the better. In the United States, the demand for acid, as it came to be known, grew as the 60s progressed, to the alarm of the authorities. They decided to call a halt to Dr. Leary's activities. LSD was made illegal, the Brotherhood was driven underground, and its supporters on the defensive. One of them, David Solomon, had been a friend and colleague of Dr. Leary's for years. He had edited several books about drugs, including LSD. But now, with the substance prescribed in 1967, Solomon and his family came to England, to Cambridge. Then, one day in early 1969, Solomon was introduced to a brilliant young chemist from Liverpool University, Richard Kemp. It wasn't long before Kemp was meeting others in Solomon's circle, learning the Brotherhood's drug techniques. It was soon apparent that the Brotherhood had recruited a first-class chemist. Another person at this time was Richard Kemp's girlfriend, Christine Bott. She was a qualified doctor of medicine who believed people would be happier if they turned on to LSD, one of the most powerful drugs in the world. It's reckoned that in the early 70s, the high point of the pop festival phenomenon, that 100,000 LSD tablets a week were being taken in Britain. Sellers came onto the scene offering microdots, domes, sugar lumps, tablets to a generation eager to experiment. But by 1973, the Brotherhood was in trouble. In the United States, the Drug Enforcement Agency had cracked down. People were beginning to talk.
It had started appearing in about 1970. I think 4% of the LSD seizures were of this one particular type, the microdot. And then they grew and grew and grew until about 75, there were 83% of the LSDs on the market.
Kemp bought this remote cottage near Tregaron in mid-Wales and came here with Bott to get away from possible police interference. The area suited them well. It was isolated, there was no drug squad, and they could get on with producing the enormous amounts of LSD they were now being asked to supply. For their new laboratory, they found an ideal location, a mansion at Carno, about an hour's drive from their cottage. An American member of the Brotherhood, Paul Anabaldi, actually bought the place. But that smooth running pattern was soon to be broken. In February 1976, Detective Chief Superintendent Dennis Greenslade was put in charge of a special LSD drug squad. 28 especially picked men and women from 11 different police forces were seconded to join him. To identify themselves, they took the name of one of their number, Julie Taylor, a local sergeant. Operation Julie had a name. The biggest police operation ever mounted. 800 officers raided 87 houses all over Britain. In all, 122 people were arrested. Over 1 million tablets were recovered and enough material taken to make another 15 million. It was the biggest drugs haul ever made. With Operation Julie over, the lengthy legal proceedings began. But a number of intriguing questions remain unanswered. Firstly, what's become of the money? Police believe they've only recovered a tenth. Secondly, there's the matter of the missing LSD. It's thought that 1.5 million tablets from the last production run are unaccounted for. So, at the end of it all, what began as an idealistic dream that would turn on an entire generation has ended in the harsh reality of Bristol Crown Court.
She knew it was coming. I know that it was a shock, but from the point when they had bought the house, she felt, the vibes were bad.
She had some instinctive, intuitive sense that things were going wrong.
She had a very strong intuitive life, psychic life, which I think you find with some people who've gone through trauma. Often those aspects of themselves do get heightened. So they do have what people might describe as active imaginations. Others might say they're tuned in to people's energies. They're aware of things, of people's qualities on an unspoken level. And I'd say Chris was very much like that.
When she was on remand, tell us what happened for her, because she was taken, first of all, separated from Richard.
Yeah. So, she's taken to Swindon, put into a cell with general people. They weren't all associated with the bust. Because the network was so secretive, she hadn't met any of these people before particularly. But David Solomon's partner was there, and so there was a familiar face there that she knew. When the trial comes, nearly everybody else pleads guilty. And in fact, they were guilty, as charged, right? Whether the morals, rights and wrongs of the situation apart. She decides not to plead guilty because she regards what they did as not being wrong. And she makes a rather defiant statement. The way it's written in the book is what led to her being given this lengthy prison sentence, and almost in a strange way, as though she was some sort of terrorist. It almost felt as though that was the thing which really riled them. A woman, a doctor, she's defiantly standing up and saying, no, I believe this was the right thing to do. You need to listen to us. You need to listen to us. And it's almost the response to that was like the response to a terrorist, was it? It's interesting you should say that, because it's so hard to know the truth when there aren't actual records that are reliable. So all of the statements and the questioning, none of the interviews have been recorded. So one of the things that they claimed Christine had said was associating herself with an IRA terrorist, which Chris denied vehemently. but they made that into a big thing. They had armed police around them as they were being taken to the court. They had snipers on tops of the buildings around the court. Sirens were going as if they were terrorists, as if they were total threat to society.
Yeah, like the Baader-Meinhof gang or something, right?
Yeah,
Like working to undermine society.
And some of the narrators want to make those links. They want to sort of imply that they were involved with the IRA or other terrorist groups, as one might name them, and that they were involved in, supporting armed revolution, which was furthest away from, I know, Christine's sort of stance. And having met Richard, he wasn't interested in that.
Richard, meanwhile, has kind of written this, what became known as the microdoctrine, which is a sort of defiant clarion call, to say, this is why we did this, is why we still believe this is right. There's a very poignant and striking moment when they're crossing paths somewhere in the remand prison where he mouths the words, "I'm sorry" to her. And that was because he didn't actually stand up and give his microdoctrine. His barrister talked him down, probably in a way for his benefit, because he got a pretty lengthy prison sentence anyway. And if he'd actually stood up and given that speech about the benefits of LSD and how he thought the judge should take it too, it probably would have added a few years onto his sentence. But he did feel like he'd betrayed her in some way by not actually keeping to their pact, do you think?
It was that, but also they used the threat pristine sentence being longer.
Right.
So it wasn't just him that would get a heftier sentence, it was her as well. Because it wouldn't be seen as mitigation, it would be seen as advocation, that they were advocating it.
Right.
So poor old Richard had written all of this down and couldn't actually say any of it. And of course, Chris wouldn't know that. So I guess she felt thrown under the bus.
She gets this sentence, and this is another extraordinary thing in a whole tale of extraordinary things. She's sent to Durham and put in H-wing with the 36 most dangerous women in the country. This is somebody who wasn't actually really involved in it at all, apart from she'd done some trips to Switzerland with the money and stuff. She had participated, but she was not a main player, as you said. And yet she gets this very heavy prison sentence. And she's in prison with Myra Hindley. Yeah. Right. Probably one of the most infamous British prisoners of all time, child murderer, public enemy number one.
Yeah.
And some other pretty desperate characters.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself these days seems astounding, no?
Yes, it's pretty galling, the decision that they made. Part of that was the prosecution framing her as duplicitous, putting forward this sympathetic, GP, gentle woman. It's a bit like the Temptress, that suddenly Chris was this villainous woman who was manipulating everybody and hence was dangerous because she might mesmerize you. Or my way of understanding it was, of course, she was living a double life. Of course she was. She wasn't going to be telling everybody that they were breaking the law and that they were doing this stuff. But it didn't mean that then she wasn't authentically her when she met people or did her stuff, around and about with patients and everything.
It seems to me there's the sort of deep misogyny of the system was revealed in the fact that she was sent to where she was sent to.
Yeah.
So there's always this Mata Hari figure who was sort of out to sort of seduce the innocents. It was, once she'd got you in her kind of in her confidence and she trusted her, that she'd then sort of slip you a tab of the most pure LSD and with the intention of actually radicalizing you so that you would assist her in the downfall of the establishment or something. And that sounds ludicrous when you describe it like that, but it did feel like that somehow, that she'd betrayed womanhood, betrayed the medical profession and all that. Because it's difficult to understand otherwise why she would be sent to such a place, and that wouldn't happen now. I'm sure that wouldn't happen now. There was no evidence of her being a terrorist. When she's in H-wing, as it still is, I don't know, in Durham, for me that was some of the most powerful parts of the story, and the contrast is extraordinary between living this beatific utopian life in mid-Wales with the goats and the organic farming and turning people on, and then suddenly you're in this darkness of this cell surrounded by people screaming and hideous bullying prison officers, cruelty all around you. It's almost like Dante or something, isn't it, in this kind of oscillating from heaven to hell,
Yeah.
you know.
Very much so. Yes, it was hard to read it, Stephen. She'd not really talked about that when I knew her. There were times when she would shake as she was thinking about stuff that was being brought up. Emotions would rise up. Because she had introduced herself as someone who'd been imprisoned for conspiracy to flood the world with LSD, I knew she had a kind of story to tell, you know, and I had vague recollection of the story myself. She did the work. She did, even before she'd gone into prison, the stuff that she did in India, the meditative states of studying yoga, of the mind-body-spirit connection, kind of served her for a while. And she describes being able to walk around when they had the exercise and sort of get into a zone and get into this state where she could imagine suddenly that she was back in the fields of Wales and walking around the mountains. But that only lasted so long.
It actually reminded me, I don't know if you've ever read it, and it was a great film too, Papillon.
Oh, yeah.
It reminded me because in the book, when he's incarcerated, Henry Cherieri's, he paces up and down his cell to keep himself fit, and he spends the entire time in his head.
Yes.
And in his head, he's walking the streets of Marseille again when he's a child, or he's recalling entire
Fascinating,
days.
Isn't it?
Yeah, and she does that, and as you said, then she practices yoga. She does handcrafts.
Yes.
And even though it does wear her down,
yes,
the grind of it, the darkness of it wears her down. She is seemingly anyway, more than anybody else there, apart from the jewel thief possibly, able to kind of weather this extraordinary hellish condition.
Yes.
And help people.
When I was doing the interviews with her, that was what was coming over to me, was prison staff at times found her really helpful because she was a comfort to the other prisoners, to the other women. She described how the whole wing would wail, and it was often around the time of the menstruation. There's this stuff that a lot of women know, is that if you live with a lot of women, often your cycles start to coincide. And this was happening in the prison as well. There's something about that really, really sort of evoked something in me.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether prisons changed much since, her experiences, hopefully, but it's difficult to read that without being horrified by what was going on there. Even though it ground her down, she did kind of survive it, and then progressively gets, into more and more open prisons, and even gets to the point where she's actually able to have a garden, right, in one of the open prisons. But she did manage to keep her countercultural spirit. That's what it felt like to me, as much as was possible.
She truly did. And I think the other bit about it was that one governor who was human and treated her like a human being. And the power of one conversation, what a difference one conversation can have to the state of someone's frame of mind. One act of kindness can go a long, long way.
Yeah.
And she had sort of got to the point of feeling suicidal in the open prison, actually had a knife. And because of her knowledge as a doctor, was working out how she could easily sort of end her life. Right
at that moment, she gets the conversation with the governor, who's a proper human being in that circumstance. Yeah, like an angel in hell sort of thing.
Yeah.
No, that's a very touching a moment, isn't it? And she also has relationships with women, which is another kind of awakening for her, and sort of felt like it saved her a bit, somewhat. Okay, she comes out of prison, and in her memoir, there is no mention of Richard at all during her time in prison, and heartbroken or betrayed or what, I'm not quite sure what it was, but they do get together again. And when I read that bit, I was thinking, oh, great, sort of, this is going to be a happy ending, right? And of course, it isn't a happy ending. They get together for a while and it doesn't work out, partly because it would seem that he's about to embark on becoming an LSD chemist again, despite all that, right? And she's like, fuck that. I'm not going back in there, right?
Do I mean that little to you?
Do I mean that little to you? Right. He, as is traditionally, seems to be the case, that he'd become even more criminalised during his sentence, whereas the opposite had happened to her. Last things that she wanted to do was to be involved in the underground, right? Yeah,
and I think because of the nature of the craft, if you like, Richard met more chemists in prison, even though he was not with any of the people involved in that particular episode. he did meet other people who had been convicted and were in for that kind of thing. And so...
And dealers and distributors.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think poignantly, he actually didn't think there was anything else he could do.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? You've got a criminal record. Come out, what are you going to do?
Exactly. You know, he also vehemently believed that this would change the course of human history.
Still a believer,
Yeah.
and that his recipe was the recipe to
Yeah.
change human history. Still believed that after
Yeah.
the prison sentence.
Yeah. And wanted others to learn from him, even if he might not do it himself, that others might learn.
The postscript to this, and I really encourage anybody listening to read Kate's book, The Untold Story of Christine Bott, which is, of course, Christine's book. It's a very, very fascinating, enjoyable, terrifying at times read. And Christine goes on, her and Richard split up. She has other relationships, not so good, most of them by the sounds of it, which the way she details it. But then a great thing happens, which is that she meets you. Well, while you're both studying to be psychotherapists, and that's where your friendship started, which takes us back to the beginning, right?
Yes.
And you were sort of very good friends for the rest of her time, even when she was in America, right? And
Yes, yeah.
right the way, and you were with her when she died.
Yeah.
But there is a postscript, because Richard Kemp, after his long silence, actually, he refused all interviews,
Yes.
all attempts to make films of Operation Julie, and he stayed away from it all. But he opened up to
Yes.
you, didn't he?
Yes.
Tell us.
I think he was really touched that Chris hadn't been on her own when she died. That's what did it. And he said, one of the first things he said to me on the phone was, "I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for what you did for Christine."
By being with her when she died and telling her story.
Yeah, he did love her. For a lot of people of his generation, it's quite hard to articulate deep feelings, even though the intention of LSD is to put you in touch with your feelings. Yeah, he said, I wish that I could have protected her. He also says, I couldn't have done it without her. And she knew that too, because she had various little sort of forks in the road, mainly through fancying someone, where she might have gone down a different route or, taken up going to follow her career in a different direction that she didn't take because of this sense of devotion and commitment and belief that it was going to change the world in a good way. And I think you could argue, actually, it did change the world profoundly and seemingly is still going to continue to change the world in a different way, maybe. There's a legacy that she and Richard have, which people need to start to really think about and think, well, actually, without that, where would we be now? I mean, all of the people who ended up in California inventing the internet and Crick with his DNA, all of these people took LSD. Steve Jobs took LSD.
Steve Jobs, Richard Branson.
And Richard was the chemist who made it. And I was surprised, Stephen, because I just assumed that level of the actual drug was what subsequently people were taking. But having met a few people who have tried it, who were sort of 20 years younger than me, they have not, they say we never had that peak experience. So it kind of feels like it was just a little blimp in a period of about 7 or 8 years when that was there. And the number of people who've written to me and said, yes, I took Richard's LSD. It changed the course of my entire life. I am so grateful to him. Please let him know.
That's amazing. And I hope that he
can hear it.
Can hear that. As we said, when you go and see him, he wants to talk about chemistry and difficult to get maybe to the heart of things. And he had rather given up hope in terms of the way the world's going and that original ecological imperative to save the planet. But as you say, he did make a huge contribution, I would say. I think there's an important thing to say here. I mean, it's probably apparent to listeners how I feel about this stuff and probably how you feel about this stuff. But it's a drug. It's against the law. It was against the law. People listening might actually think it should still be against the law. I'm not assuming anything. It's naive to believe that anybody can take it in any circumstances and it's going to enlighten them. You know, it obviously has that potential, but it has the potential also to mess people up big time. So to just randomly, even if you make the best acid in the world and then just send it out there, without any knowledge about who's going to get hold of it and what they're going to do with it, is at best naive, isn't it, really? Massively irresponsible, you could even say too. So let's add that in as well as a flavour. I think that's important to remember. Did Christine ever take acid again after she came out of prison, do you know?
That's a good question. I honestly couldn't answer. I don't believe she did. I think she saw it as having a purpose, and she'd use it to sort of clear herself, if you like.
I suppose it'd be difficult to take anything but the microdot after you've experienced that.
Yeah, she wouldn't just mess around with any old stuff.
Any old blotters.
Yeah. One of the gifts Christine offers with her writing and her story is this admission that, we are all capable of lots of different things as human beings, depending on the situation that we're in. There's one point where she, by accident, has had a sniff of LSD and she's at a border and the guards she feels like they're playing cat and mouse with her, and she's going through, and she says, and I make an acquaintance with the killer in my soul. And I think many people would deny that there is even a part of them that is like that. But I think unless we come to terms with the human condition and start to look at our own selves and what we're capable of and work through it and find ways of understanding ourselves rather than just reacting all the time, then there won't be progress. And I think that's where Chris led to when she found the work of Carl Rogers, humanist psychologist, and looking at, empathy, the importance of that, of being authentic, and that this was often how people could actually change, was by being heard and understood.
Right, so maybe not the kind of smash and grab raved on enlightenment that LSD was, to catapult yourself into another realm.
Yeah.
But to work through...
Do the hard stuff, get the emotions out there, there's messy stuff.
That's what she came to later, and of course, in a sense, that's the happy ending, I think, to some of this story, isn't it?
What I think she was never short of feeling was a wish, a desire to help people, to encourage people to wake up to their own power, to empower people. That there was, if you like, a huge belief in the human project, if you like, in human beings as essentially good if given the right environment and a loving sort of approach. A
slow path maybe to human health and well-being, possibly, rather than crash bang wallop. But I think we can be grateful, particularly living in an era when psychedelics are being reassessed and their use of them is being reassessed, and possibly, who knows, people like Richard and Christine these days might be working for Wellcome Trust or something, one of those big, in developing treatments which would help the afflicted.
There are people I know who had been to prison who are exactly doing that, because I hear from the chemists as well. Well, they have come that full circle. But for Chris, that wasn't going to be the case. She then continued to do stuff that she felt she could get her heart behind and help progress. And she certainly, was a big advocate towards me and encouraged me hugely. So, there was a good arc of life in that time where she was a dear, dear friend.
So maybe you should, in the next edition of The Untold Story of Christine Bott, maybe you should subtitle it Breaking Good.
Lovely idea. Thank you very much. Take that.
Kate, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thanks so much to Kate. Of course, we barely scratched the surface of Christine Bott's story, and in fact, of Kate's own story and adventures, which, after she got turned on by one of Richard Kemp's microdots, took a rather dark and dramatic countercultural turn. I trust that she will write her own story one of these days or years. I will link to her work and the books that she has written with Christine and Richard in the show notes. What do you think? LSD, misunderstood elixir of enlightenment and life, or terribly dangerous intoxicant? Maybe it's both. Should it be illegal? Let me know. It's always great to hear from friends. I'd like to thank Adrian and Rachel and Dan at Soho Radio, And thanks to you for spending your countercultural time here with us at the Bureau of Lost Culture. If you've got more time to spend, there's more stories at bureauoflostculture.com. And we will see you down the road, over the hillsides, and round the bend for more stories from the underground, from the other side.